Hello and welcome to this week's episode of We Used to Be Journos, the podcast where two media insiders break down broken news. I am one of those media insiders. My name is Jan Fran, and sitting opposite from me is not Antony Loewenstein as per usual.
It's not.
It's not. It is a gentleman by the name of Antony Loewenstein, who is also a
journo.
A journo.
Not used to be. I'm a journo.
Yeah, he's a journo.
I
He
call
absolutely is a
myself a
journo.
journo, yeah.
That's right. He is the founder of Declassified Australia, an independent media organisation that has been doing some great work, FYI. Also an author, wrote recently The Palestine Laboratory, which won a Walkley in 2023. I could go on about your background, but I won't. So this podcast episode is going to be a collaboration between We Used to Be Journos and the Antony Loewenstein podcast, which recently started up. So whether or not you're listening to it in the Journos feed or in Antony's feed, you're going to get the same episode. And in this chat, I think we're going to talk about, obviously, the Bondi terror attack, the aftermath of the terror attack, how it has been covered, how it's sort of been received by the community, some of the ways that certain agendas are being spread and the role that certain politicians and the media have played in that. But also, I think, importantly, the path forward. And how it is that we kind of move on as a country and as people that care very deeply about human rights and the right of everybody to live freely and safely in this country and elsewhere. I kind of just want to start where I think a lot of interviews with you have started for good reason, which is December 14 in the evening when the massacre was happening. How did you first hear about it?
I was at home with my family. We were, I guess, marking the first night of Hanukkah. I'm Jewish, as you say, but I'm not religious at all. I mean, I celebrate certain Jewish events culturally rather than religiously. My young kids enjoy lighting the Hanukkah candles, which we were doing. And I think we got some text messages that something was going on in Bondi. I didn't know the details, of course. And it soon became pretty clear that it was obviously a terrorist attack, didn't know who it was. And the first thought was it's either going to be two groups, either neo-Nazis or likely an Islamist attack. Obviously, we now know it was the latter. And I guess we started watching, the broadcast TV, ABC, 7, 9, which in those situations are trying to do kind of an impossible task. I know you guys talked about it on the podcast recently. But no, I guess my first response was kind of fear and sadness, and pretty quickly, which is where I still am now, kind of anger at lots of people. I mean, anger at the people who did it, of course, who are mass murderers, but anger at how it's been politicized and other groups, but I guess we'll get to that.
Well, I think it's probably pertinent to get to that up the top because I'm going to be completely honest with you. I really debated whether or not to have this conversation. I debated whether or not even to do our last podcast episode, and we talked a little bit about that on the show, but I'm so utterly overwhelmed by I guess you can call it reporting if you're going to be gracious, but to some extent the noise, especially the noise that we're seeing on social media, all of the takes, all of the responses, all of the talking heads. And I'm really cognizant about not wanting to add to that and cognizant about allowing for a period of grief, right? There's a flip side to that, which is that when certain narratives start spreading, and certain agendas, because the first person that I heard from was the Prime Minister of Israel, before any official here in Australia.
Within a matter of hours. And many, many other Israeli government ministers who mirrored his shameful suggestion that somehow the terror attack, which then we didn't even know who really did it.
No, we didn't even know whether, what was happening at the time. This
was the fault of Albanese, was the fault of the Australian government, who appeased, apparently, I guess, Palestinians. This is the argument, and appeased recognising a Palestinian state, which they did this year, and had allowed pro-Palestine protests, which in a democracy, by the way, is legal, FYI, Netanyahu.
I mean, we're a few days in now, and I think that line has been parroted to some extent near unanimously by our media.
Not just the Murdoch press.
No, not just the Murdoch press, exactly. So I guess my question is, do you have that concern as well about, should I just shut the fuck up in this time, or is this actually the time to speak? Where do you sit on that?
Well, the latter. I think being silent now is exactly the wrong call, because lots of other voices and those in positions of power and influence are not just shaping a narrative, but pushing and pressuring governments to act in certain ways. And the idea that, as you said, within hours of this attack, and now we're in roughly a week and a half after the attack, much of the mainstream media, and this includes the ABC, Guardian, frankly, the 9 papers, Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, the Murdoch Press, which you'd expect because they're basically a propaganda outfit for Israel, are parroting a very similar line, which is almost we deserved it, we being Australians. The argument being that Jews, some Jews, have been warning for, I guess, 2 years since October 7, that there's been, this is the argument, an explosion of antisemitism. We've been begging the Australian government, state government, to do something, don't recognise Palestine, ban pro-Palestine protests, arrest more people. I mean, do something. It's not entirely clear what that is. And now this has happened. And there is, at this point, zero evidence that there is any connection between what happened in Bondi, a horrific, clearly anti-Semitic terror attack by 2 deranged men, father and son, and the so-called pro-Palestine movement, which is a global movement that has existed long before October 7 and has certainly accelerated since. But there's zero connection. So the fact that now is the time to speak, because if we don't speak, the voices that most people are hearing, and I'm getting huge amounts of messages from people, Jew, non-Jew, and others, who are saying to me, why is most of the media allowing an Israeli government credibly accused of genocide setting any agenda for this conversation? And my sense, a lot of it is that there are some journalists who are ideologically aligned with the Israeli government. Okay, that's bad enough. But others, I think, frankly, there is so little honest reporting about the Jewish community itself. Most people, and I understand this to an extent, most people in the media in general don't want to criticize the Jewish community. I mean, it's, you know, a week and a half after the attack.
Yeah, the timing.
The timing.
Yeah.
Now, I guess I understand that in a way, but also that's exactly the wrong way to view this. That I guarantee you, if it was an attack on the Muslim community, that'd be a terror attack against Muslims in Sydney or Brisbane or wherever. There would be a necessary, robust conversation about the Muslim community, as there should be in any community. It's not like there's a so-called acceptable period of grieving before we talk about the fact that there is a sizable proportion of the so-called mainstream Jewish community which has been radicalized for years and has a deep antipathy and racism towards any Arab, Palestinian, or Muslim. Now, I am, to be clear, not saying all Jews. I am saying that the vast majority of so-called Jewish leadership that the media is platforming day in, day out, have voices which have spent the last 2.5 years since October 7 blindly, uncritically supporting everything the Israeli government does. And now we're supposed to listen to them as a voice of reason. And I fundamentally oppose that. And I think huge amounts of people, Jew and non-Jew, feel exactly the same way. You guys do not speak for us being Jews, us being a sane community. When you have spent, frankly, 50 years...
I mean, they do speak for some Jews in that
they speak for some Jews.
An umbrella body of
yes,
that represents
I didn't vote
Jewish
for them.
people and organisations.
Yes,
Sure.
and there's, look, any... organisation, there are Muslim groups that don't speak for Muslims. I understand that. But these Jewish groups have aligned themselves with the most radical racist elements of the Israeli government, Netanyahu and others, and therefore claim to speak for Jews. They do not. They speak for some Jews.
Okay.
But not even close to all of us. And growing numbers of young Jews do not subscribe to that idea that somehow what keeps us safe as Jews is endless occupation, because that's essentially what they're arguing. We have to basically occupy Palestinians forever, because if we dare give anything back to those awful Arabs, they're going to kill us all. That's essentially the argument in a very brutal way, but that's what they say. That's what they think. And we've seen that in the last week and a half since the Bondi attack.
When you say we've seen that, where have we seen that?
We have seen the fact that in the much of the Sky News coverage, Murdoch Media, the Australian newspaper, written by Jewish writers and non-Jews, in parts of the Nine papers, in parts of the ABC, commentators, some Jews, some not Jewish, who are arguing that the Albanese government, this is the allegation, the Albanese government's position has been weak since October 7. We've appeased, Australia has appeased so-called pro-Palestine voices. We haven't been supportive of Israel enough. I mean, the propaganda outfit of the Murdoch press said explicitly in editorials days after the attack, maybe even the day after, that Australia has fundamentally failed because we didn't show Israel the support that it deserves and needs. So what does that have to do with the Bondi attack? One of the attackers is dead. The other one has not spoken.
Yeah, what does that have to do with the Bondi
Zero.
attack?
It has zero.
What is the link?
There is no link. There is an attempt to weaponize a horrific event, which you are seeing in other parts of the world. Those attacks, but also weaponizing it to support, like is happening in the UK and in the US, when there is an attempt to criminalize and silence anyone who supports Palestine, Jewish or non-Jewish, under the guise of you're making Jews unsafe. To which I say, firstly, which Jews? And secondly, what an absurd thing to say. I live in a supposed democracy. It's a very flawed one, but a democracy. I have the right to say, within reason, what I want. I'm not threatening anybody. I have the right to say what I want about an Israeli government. I'm not an Israeli citizen. I live in Australia. The Israeli government is a foreign country, and I have every right to say whatever the hell I want about that government and the people who support them. Anything that I want. I'm not threatening anybody. I'm not inciting violence against anyone. I'm simply saying I have the right to criticize the Israeli government. And I've done that for, as many Jews have, for decades. And it's becoming more extreme as time goes on and endangering more of us as Jews because of that proud racism, which I see mirrored in much of the mainstream Jewish community here.
Okay, just on that point, and because, like, you know, we're a media show and we critique and look at the reporting of certain events and, you know, what journalists should and shouldn't do and can and can't do. In the aftermath of something like this, right, I understand the reticence to kind of push back against people like Gillian Siegel, particularly in the first 24 hours, really the first week, if not longer, because of how horrific the attack was and how important it is, I think, to give space to Jewish voices. So is it that the mainstream media is giving space to the wrong Jewish voices, only certain Jewish voices? Do you want to see them give more space to a plurality of Jewish voices? Have they done that adequately? Like, what would your suggestion be for the way the mainstream media, not a monolith, I grant you, but somehow monolithical in their...
On this issue
almost, a little bit.
Yes. Well, for example, on the night of the attack, within hours, Gillian Siegel, for those who don't know, the antisemitism envoy appointed by the Albanese government after October 7, who has a history of being a pro-Israel lobbyist. So the government knew what it was getting. On that night, puts out a statement, I'm paraphrasing it, words to the effect of, after the protests on the Opera House after October 7, protests across the Harbour Bridge, basically what did we expect? We warned the Albanese government that these crazy people are protesting a genocide, and therefore we asked them to do more for us being Jews, and they didn't do it, and here we are. Now we want action. Now, my view is a bit different to yours, Jan, which is to say, you, Gillian Siegel, have put yourself, because of your position, at the centre of politics. I have every right to criticise you and challenge you and debunk what you are saying. Every right to do that. Now, has much of the media done that? No. They're tiptoeing around that. After Siegel released her report, whenever it was, 3-4 months ago, it seemed to me the government was likely to ignore most of it or kick it down the road, because it was either politically unpalatable or they didn't want to do it for whatever their internal reasons were. Here we are after the Bondi attack. The Albanese government announced within 4 days they're going to do some of it, not all of it.
Yeah.
Now, to me, a decent journalist would question what is being proposed. It's not a radical question to say, would that have any effect, Ms. Siegel, Mr. Albanese, on an attack that was targeting Jews? So just remind me what apparently monitoring ABC or SBS media coverage, which is what she wants to do.
Yeah. How's that going to stop
How's that going to stop two
lunatics?
psychos who are radicalized somewhere online in the Philippines, God knows where? How? It won't. Because the agenda is not that. The agenda is far bigger than that. The agenda is that many pro-Israel forces realize they have lost the agenda. They have lost the momentum. Polling shows in most Western countries, US, Europe, UK, Australia, particularly younger Jews and younger people in general, are fundamentally disgusted with what Israel has been doing and can separate, by the way, Israel and Jews. There was a recent poll that came out that showed that most people can differentiate between an Israeli committing crimes in Gaza or the West Bank or Syria or Lebanon or Yemen, the list goes on, and a Jewish person living in Bondi. But it's worth saying much of the coverage here has been, how dare critics of Israel say that Jews in Australia have anything to do with what happened in Gaza since October 7th. I'm sorry, really? We have mainstream Jewish community leaders here supporting the government 110%. We have rabbis openly
Supporting the government of Israel.
Openly advocating for the IDF in synagogues.
Well,
So-
I mean, one of the rabbis that was killed in the attack, I'm only bringing this up because, that is an example of
Yes.
what it is that you are talking about, was himself very supportive of the IDF, travelled to Israel. I'm not sure
Supportive
how
of the
many occasions.
IDF, had supported basically occupation of the West Bank by Israel, had been demonizing Arabs online. This is not hard to find. You can find this within minutes. I have not seen that mentioned in any coverage. Now, to be clear, obviously none of that justifies murdering him or anybody, clearly. But it's pretty relevant to me to understand a context for people who are being potentially targeted for who they are.
Why is that relevant?
Well, it's relevant to understand who the victims are and what their backgrounds were. Did it have anything to do with why they were targeted? I don't know, but it's not irrelevant to mention it. I mean, Chabad is a large Jewish organization aligning itself with the Israeli government and its most extreme actions. Is it not relevant to say that the event in Bondi was organized by them? Many of the people killed were from that organization. You can say that in a sentence in an article without somehow implicitly justifying their murder. Of course it doesn't justify that,
No.
but it explains context and detail. That's what journalists should be doing. But my view is they're petrified of saying anything that might somehow impugn people who have been murdered. Now, you might say that's sensitivity. Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Look, I understand that inclination.
Yeah.
I don't, this is, I don't know if I am right or I'm
Yeah.
wrong on this point, but and to your point that you made earlier, if the Muslim community had been targeted and then people started going after the clerics and the extremists within that community a week later, I think that there would be an outcry. I think
There
people
may
would
be.
be like, these people have just been murdered. They're in a period of grief. And like, this conversation will come. Does it have to happen now? This has been the thing that I wrestle with, and why I'm wrestling with like having this conversation is now the time. And it seems like on one hand it is, on one hand it isn't.
I mean, I've said this for a long time, and it's worth saying again. Jewish lives are seen as far more important than Muslim or Arab lives. That's reflected in how much of the media covers these questions long before Bondi. Can you imagine if there'd be 70, 80 or 90,000 Jews killed in, say, Israel in the last 2.5 years? It wouldn't have happened. God forbid it ever does, because there would have been international military intervention if there'd been some horrible terrorist group that wanted to do that. Whereas if there's 70, 80, 90, 100,000 Palestinians killed, the vast majority of civilians, well, it's war. What can you do? That's the argument. Well, it's complicated. Such is life. So the current New South Wales government wants to put in place stronger laws to go after so-called hate preachers, Muslim hate preachers. Now, it's worth saying, since the Bondi attack, there has been some good reporting in the Sydney Morning Herald particularly, talking about how many Muslims in the Sydney community have been warning authorities about certain extremist Muslim preachers. Authorities had said to them, we want to keep certain places open, madrasas or centres, for intelligence gathering purposes. Now, I can understand that in a way, but at the other hand, so here we are in a situation where there seems to be still developing as a story, some evidence that some of these extreme preachers inspired, assisted in some way some of the killers, at least one of them. There's only 2 killers. Now, is it relevant to talk about the fact that the legislation that the governments are going to introduce is only targeting Muslim so-called hate preachers? Now, I've got no issue finding a way legally to go after people who are calling for the death or incitement of others, usually Jews. And that does concern me as a Jew and a citizen. However, are we not going to also look at, for example, Jewish hate preachers? They're real. Rabbis and others who deeply advocate for the murder of Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims. This is happening in so-called mainstream Australia, mainstream Britain, mainstream America. No one seems that concerned about that. Now, are there Jewish killers killing 15 Muslims in Sydney? No. And let's hope it never happens. Are there huge amounts of Jews killing massive amounts of Arabs in the Middle East? Yeah, there are. And who cares about that? Throughout this whole process since Bondi, what we're being told is the Albanese government hasn't been pro-Israel enough. Now, as a co-editor of Declassified Australia, my colleague Peter Cronau and Kelly Tranter have done amazing work showing throughout this whole process, Australia has continued to sell F-35 fighter jet parts. We had a story out just this week by Kelly Tranter saying that Australia is testing at the moment a system to put on weapons to target better, which has been battle tested in Gaza.
What more support do you want?
Like, what more support would you like to... I mean, essentially, it's pretty clear what elements of the Jewish community do want, because they've said it explicitly, including Josh Frydenberg. Ban the protests. Stop the protests. Under what law? Now, they're going to introduce laws to try to restrict those protests. Now, I've been to many protests. I haven't been to every single one, but many.
Yeah.
They are legal protests. They're non-violent. And when Jewish people have said to me, I have not felt safe going into the city of Melbourne or Sydney for the last 2.5 years, my response is, what's that based on? Because there's someone wearing a keffiyeh? Is someone going around these rallies saying, kill all Jews? No. Has there ever been a sign that says anything offensive? Maybe. I mean, I haven't seen every single sign, but 99.9% of it are peaceful protests, including many Jews who are saying, stop the genocide or stop the war.
I think people need to understand is that in all of these protests, and even within like the pro-Palestine movement, call it whatever it is that you want, there are so many Jewish people that are part of that.
Yes.
And there were so many Jewish people on that bridge.
But not the right kind of Jews according to the elements of the mainstream Jewish community. This is the point. So people like me and the Jewish Council of Australia that I've involved with and others, we're not the right kind of Jews because we don't see our salvation or safety intimately tied to an endless occupying Israel. That is what that Jewish agenda is. It's basically saying that Israel is somehow our salvation. I've seen since the Bondi attack, mainstream Jewish so-called leaders saying, and this is happening after October 7, we need to consider whether it's safe in Australia, we might need to move to Israel. Now, as a Jew, for those who aren't aware, if I go to Israel tomorrow, assuming they let me in, I could, if I prove that I'm Jewish, I could become a citizen within months. Any Jew has that right around the world. Now, I've fundamentally opposed that on moral reasons.
Sure.
But the idea somehow that it's going to be safer in Israel as a Jew, it's more unsafe to be a Jew in Israel than anywhere else on the planet. And I thought that long before October 7. This is the reality. Now, is there a major problem with anti-Semitism in the West? Definitely. Is it growing? Yes. Does it worry me? Hell yes. But the idea somehow that has zero connection to what is happening in the Middle East doesn't justify shooting up a Jewish event. But the research shows that clearly there is a connection between how many people view Jewish people. When you have mainstream Jewish leaders across every Western country saying day in, day out, Israel must be supported 110%. And you have many people on their phones every day saying, wow, so Jews support the slaughter, torture, and murder of Palestinians, do they? Wow. How do I feel about Jews then?
Right.
How do we not see a connection there? The connection is real, and it's a problem, and it's causing real anti-Semitism. And when you see as a Jew your salvation or your protection associated with a state like Israel, which by definition discriminates against others, you have a problem.
That's a conversation that I think needs to be led by Jewish people. But on that point, there's something that you said earlier about being the wrong kind of Jew, which is because you don't see the salvation of Jewish people tied to the state of Israel. And we talked earlier about your position being a bit of like a dissenting position within the Jewish community. Do you see that changing? You mentioned young Jews and their attitudes to Israel being different. The Jewish Council is only something that was started, I believe, in 2024, early 2024, something like that. Like, do you see that position changing? How do you see the makeup of the community?
Let me just give people a bit of a sense of the Jewish community, just a few stats. So there's 27 million Australians, roughly. There's about 120,000 Jews, small. Roughly Sydney, Melbourne divided. Obviously other cities too, but mostly Sydney, Melbourne. Melbourne, and I grew up in Melbourne. Melbourne has had for many years one of the highest proportion of Holocaust survivors in the world. Obviously,
but that means that their grandparents would have come out really after the Second World War.
Indeed.
As opposed to other countries where they might have come out at the turn of the century or before all of that.
Indeed. And there are obviously many of those people are now dying, of course, with old age. But yes, so that deeply affected how many Australian Jews, particularly Melbourne, Sydney, saw Israel as a potential protector if God forbid. And I was told that when I was growing up too. I mean, I grew up in Melbourne. I wasn't unsafe being there, and my family were not radical Zionists by any means. But we were always told, well, you know, most of my family were killed in the Holocaust. Some escaped, came to Australia, Europe, and elsewhere, UK and the US. If we were ever in trouble somewhere, Israel was always a place we could go to.
Right.
And become a citizen. I mean, I would argue that was a comfortable delusion, but that's what I was told. And there's no doubt that in the US and the UK and Australia, based on polling, there is a growing shift, particularly around Jews 18 to 35, some of whom for sure support Israel. A lot of Australian young Jews go to Jewish schools. They're very Zionist. They're very pro-Israel. Those institutions exist and they're strong here, more so than many other equivalent democracies. But a lot of young Jews are seeing what is going on in Gaza or Palestine, and they do not feel an affinity with a state or a mainstream community or their synagogue or their rabbi who is calling for blind support of that, realizing that is not protecting them. And that's particularly pronounced in the US, where this is happening long before October 7, where growing numbers of particularly younger Jews are fundamentally turning against Israel, either becoming anti-Zionist or wanting to reform the Jewish community from within. Some are leaving the community, some are building alternative organizations, whether it's Jewish Voice for Peace or If Not Now, or involved with Jewish Currents, the magazine out of New York, whatever it may be. And polling in the US shows, particularly in the last 2 years, that growing numbers of young Jews see what Israel's doing as genocide. I'm not saying all that. See what Israel's doing as committing war crimes and seeing it as endangering us as Jews by the action of Israel. And that is leading to I call it a civil war in the Jewish community. It's a non-violent civil war, but a civil war in the Jewish community is alive and well, and it is so necessary. Because for decades and decades, the mainstream voices have been Israel right or wrong. It's worth saying in the last years that despite the growing suggestion that there is reduced safety for Jews, that the amount of Jews who are moving to Israel is tiny as supposed protection, whereas the number of Jews who are leaving Israel is very high. And to live in who knows where, if they have a second passport. And I mean, there's sort of issues with that in a way, because of course Palestinians haven't got that luxury, which is its own fucked up problem right there. But the idea somehow that there's going to be, as Netanyahu clearly says either explicitly or otherwise, and the Israeli government often says this, you will never be fully safe in the diaspora, ever. You're never going to be safe outside of Israel. The only place you can be really safe is here in Israel. Now, that is just an absolute lie. It's a lie. And the idea that Netanyahu, the man who on his watch, October 7th...
would have, I assume in the eyes of many Jewish people, proved that you can't be safe in the diaspora, and here you go.
There are no doubt conversations, Jan, happening in the Australian Jewish community about, do we have a future here? I'm not denying that fear, and I don't certainly feel that I have any desire to go to Israel, but do I acknowledge that fear? Absolutely. You cannot see what happened in Bondi and not feel a degree of fear and discomfort and worry and a belief that, the so-called solution to this is not to have sort of higher walls and more security, which is what essentially the government is proposing. That might be an inverted commas solution today and tomorrow, but that's not a solution to anything in the end. And it's interesting that one of the challenges I think that many Jews and non-Jews have, which is sort of ignored by much of the mainstream media here in Australia, is that the whole concept of Zionism years ago was always that we were never going to be safe in Europe, and therefore we as Jews have to find our own space somewhere, ignoring the fact that the Arabs had been there forever. Okay, putting that issue aside, and therefore we have to build our own state. Now, 1948 happens, Israel's founded, it was built on ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Israel has built its own ghetto. It's ghettoized itself. Higher walls, more security, as if believing that that is what brings you safety. It does not. So in the West, in Australia or elsewhere, the idea that we are told that the only way we need to be safe is either go to Israel or accept blind support for Israel. Josh Frydenberg, John Howard, Scott Morrison, much of the mainstream media has amplified these voices, most of whom are profoundly discredited on a range of issues, not least the question of terrorism, Israel, war, Iraq, the list goes on. There's so little reflection about comments by so-called leaders in Australia. We have this deference in our media. Politician X speaks. Please tell us all your thoughts, dear leader. Do you want to question anything? Oh, it's not the right time. When is the right time? Now is the right time. This is the time. John Howard's wheeled out to basically say, now's not the right time to talk about gun laws. It's a distraction. We have an antisemitism crisis. Obviously, antisemitism is a problem. Yeah.
It's like it's exactly the right time and it's exactly the wrong time at the same time. Yes,
well, I would think it's just the right time.
Okay,
I mean, I know that. But I mean, you're. And I understand where you're coming from. Your feeling is sort of, it's sensitive. It's like, everything is raw.
Yes, everything is raw.
The funeral's just finished.
Yes.
I get that. Yes. But look at what various forces are trying to put in place.
I know.
That's why the time is now.
I know. I do I completely grapple with that.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I don't know how you reflect on this, but I think there's something in the reporting. This is just anecdotal from my observations, right? A lot of journalists live in Bondi. And if they don't live in Bondi, they know someone who lives in Bondi. And if they don't know someone who lives in Bondi, they live in the eastern suburbs and they go to Bondi. So this is an attack on them in a sense. I saw an ABC cameraman in one of the very early ABC stories. He was featured in the story as a Bondi local.
Yeah.
And they said, ABC cameraman lives here and he came out and did this and X, Y, and Z and tried to help these people. I don't begrudge them doing that at all. But I thought, this is really interesting that actually the media is part of the ecosystem of victims, because yes, principally it was the Jewish community, absolutely. And then it was the Bondi community.
Absolutely.
And then it was really Australia and the people that live in Bondi, that sort of thing. And there was another piece that I saw just recently by Nick Bryant, who's a journalist. I believe he's British.
Yeah, but living here, yeah.
But it was please don't, God, I can't remember the exact headline, but it was like, don't destroy my happy place, right? So this is Nick Bryant's happy place. Again, do not begrudge him writing this. I totally understand why he did. No shade at all. But there is this idea that, this is kind of an attack on us. And I guess maybe some of that reticence of journalists to push back against the politicization maybe comes from, I might be being too gracious here, I don't know, but maybe comes from a sense of their own grief and loss and shock.
Look, yes, maybe some of that's there. I don't want to suggest that it's not, possibly, probably, but we've seen in the last 2 years since October 7 how much of most of the mainstream media is so ill-equipped professionally, ideologically, ethically, to report, cover, discuss what is happening in not just, I would say, Israel, Palestine, the Middle East, but also here. That you have seen time after time after time demonization of peaceful protesters who are calling for an end to genocide in Gaza or a cessation of violence, whatever the calls have been, as if somehow they're the problem. Just to be clear, when you have 300,000 Australians crossing the Harbour Bridge, that's not exactly a fringe movement. That's a mainstream. And I was there and many of us were there and it was pouring rain and there were people from all backgrounds, Jew, Christian, Muslim, randos, all sorts of people.
This is the other thing is like, I was on that bridge. You were on that bridge. A lot of people were on that bridge.
It was wet.
It was wet. It was a pouring rain. And
Worst day possible, weather-wise, but amazing.
But all of those people showed up. I know why I was there.
Indeed.
Because for 2 years, I have seen people, women, children, men, the elderly, babies, you name it, be killed on camera. I've seen that.
Yeah.
And I abhor violence. And so that's what I was doing on that bridge.
Yeah.
It was a cry for please, please stop this horror. That's what motivated me to be there. This unprecedented level of horror that we have seen live streamed on our phones. And one thing that I have found to be so frustrating is that in all of the commentary, that has just been absolutely erased.
But that's not, I mean, obviously I agree with you, but you know what? So many people out there see that too. They see that erasure. They see that silencing. They're writing to me, to you guys, to whoever else. They're saying on social media, wherever they have a platform. I see it hugely since Bondi. People see that. And what is trying to be done here by, I fear, the Albanese government, the New South Wales government, elements of the Jewish community, much of the media, is to replicate what is happening in other parts of the world to try to shut down or at least neuter a pro-Palestine movement. In the UK this year, Palestine Action, a non-violent organisation, has been branded a terrorist organisation, and there are people protesting peacefully, mostly older and grannies and others.
And you see them just get hauled off by the cops, and they're just holding a sign saying, I support Palestine Action. And they're getting charged with terrorism.
At the moment, since the Bondi attack, the British police and the government has said if you come out and say, globalise the Intifada, which this term has been repeated ad nauseum. For the record, I've never used it. I've never seen it being used. I'm not saying no one's ever said it. I'm sure they have. But this idea somehow that the government's going to ban a phrase. So just to be clear, if we ban globalise the Intifada, can we also ban other phrases as well? So how about if we say fuck Muslims? Can we say fuck Islam? Can we say fuck Jews? Is that anti-Semitic? Should that be banned as well? No, I don't like those. I never use those expressions. My point in saying that is if we're going to specifically ban particular phrases, which can be interpreted, by the way, in 1,000 ways, globalise the Intifada can mean a myriad of things. Myriad of things. I'm not saying it's never used nefariously. I'm sure it has been. But as I said, I know people who have been involved in this movement for years who've never heard it used. I'm not saying it's never been used, but I've never heard it used. My point in trying to silence or neuter or crush a pro-Palestine movement is what it says about how many in the elites see all of us. They see us as the threat. The idea that you peacefully protest something that they are supporting and backing and arming and funding says all you need to know about how they view all of us, with contempt and fear. So therefore, if they try to criminalize someone who wants to protest legitimately and peacefully in Sydney or Melbourne or London or elsewhere, then ultimately what they're saying is they fear all of us. I've thought that for a long time, and it's clearer now after Bondi that is happening now here. An attempt, and I do not think it'll work.
You don't think it'll work?
No, I don't think it'll work, and it shouldn't work.
I want to come back to that in a second. You don't think it'll work, but just on the point of the protest, and I wonder I'm interested to hear what your response to this is. The Premier, Chris Minns, said about the protest, because now there's been restrictions on that. that, again, I haven't got the exact quote, but it's something like they've started something that they cannot contain.
Yeah.
Or this idea that, whatever sentiment is happening here on the bridge cannot be contained if people were to take it in other directions, right? What do you make of that idea?
Well, contain what exactly? I mean, essentially what he's saying is that all these people for 2+ years who've been protesting to either stop the Australian government backing Israel, arming Israel, or stopping Israel's genocide somehow are unleashing anti-Semitic forces that cannot be bottled. My response to that as a Jew is, you're a fucking disgrace for even suggesting that. Not you, Chris Mintz.
I figured.
Yes, just to be clear. Because the idea somehow that those protests themselves are A, anti-Semitic, or B, leading to hatred of Jews, I fundamentally oppose that idea. I do not accept that as a premise. I just don't. At all. There are many Jews on that protest. They're not being harassed or attacked or killed, or it is not. Now, the idea somehow that this is being conflated with, as we are seeing over and over again, some Jewish people will say, I'm triggered or I'm upset or I feel threatened if you're wearing a keffiyeh. I see the sign Free Palestine. I feel threatened by that. Okay, I'm not saying that certain Jewish people don't feel that. Fine. But and what? And therefore, what are you proposing? That we ban the keffiyeh? We ban a Free Palestine sign? If you don't feel comfortable with it, that's up to you to work that out. Let's talk about what it means. Let's explain that keffiyeh is not essentially a Nazi symbol. It's a Palestinian scarf.
It's a Levantine scarf, actually.
Yes, Levantine scarf. It is it comes down to the same point that ties into what Chris Mintz has been saying. Jewish fear is weaponized in the service of the worst possible policies and laws. I'm not disagreeing that certain Jewish people don't feel discomfort with protests down the street in Sydney or Melbourne. I'm not saying some Jews don't feel that way. They do. They say it. I think we have to hear what they say and acknowledge it. I acknowledge it. But and what? And what's the point? So therefore you say you feel discomfort because you've been told by much of the media and the Jewish press and your community leaders for years that essentially hundreds of thousands of Nazis were marching across the Harbour Bridge. When literal Nazis...
Yeah. Well, they were literally leading protests and speaking in front of various parliaments in
Melbourne.
Sydney,
About 2-3 months ago, there were 30,000 Melburnians who were protesting. There was a speech on the steps of Parliament House in Melbourne by one of the so-called leaders.
And attacking Indigenous people as well.
Now, are we looking to criminalise neo-Nazis? Now, obviously, there's a whole questions about what.
Well, there is some criminalisation of certain symbols and of
there
certain,
are symbols, swastika, for example, now,
hand gestures.
I feel very mixed about that, which is a whole separate conversation. Right. But yes, anyway,
there's a couple of people that have sort of reached out to me in this time to ask, like, how are we to be in this country? What do we do? How do we move forward? I wouldn't deign to have the wisdom to really be able to answer that question. But I did have one question come in that I thought would be a good question for you to answer. Yep. And I've said this to the gentleman. His name is Angus. Yep. He sent a question in. I've said I'm going to put it to
a Jewish friend or no?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Certainly didn't mention that he was Jewish. But he said that he had a question, and I said I would put it to you. So I might just play it for you.
Hi, my name is Angus. As someone who has spoken out about Israel and the genocide they're committing, the full implementation of the envoy into anti-Semitism and its recommendations, including the adoption of a definition of anti-Semitism that states criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, scares the shit out of me. We will then be fully allowed to criticize our own government, which is as it should be, but unable to criticize a government that is committing a genocide without this being labelled as hate speech. I'm a university student that has spoken in several of my classes about what is happening. We learned about colonialism and its horrors in our First Nations topic, and I feel the dialogue around colonialism is that it's something from the past, but we are seeing it happen horrifically in real time. How can I be someone from Australia that cares deeply about humanitarian crises and has humanitarian values, but cannot criticise a government that is committing genocide?
Well, I thank Angus for that question, and what he's talking about there, just for some people who maybe aren't clear, is that one of the recommendations by Gillian Siegel, the anti-Semitism envoy, which is now likely to be pushed through by Albanese, is this so-called IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. It's too complex to go into it here, but in short, what it tries to do, in my view, disastrously, and there's been huge amounts of criticism, people can find that online, is that it tries to suggest that there's certain things you can say about Israel which might be acceptable, but if you, for example, say that Israel is a racist endeavor, Israel was born in sin based on colonialism, and then that potentially, almost certainly, breaches that code, which is an absurd situation. So what I would say to Angus and anyone else is, we cannot stop speaking honestly about when we see these truths. Now, obviously, if you're a student or a lecturer or someone else in the media, you are almost certainly likely to think a lot more about what you will say about a foreign country. This is not, if you're an Australian citizen living in Australia, you essentially are being told from potentially the top level of government, from Albanese down, that there's certain ways that are acceptable and legal to discuss Israel. Now, obviously, there are certain things that I would never say about Israel, which I think are hate speech. Like I wouldn't say that about any country. But I think we need to just simply refute this code. I mean, I don't see any other way apart from, in a way, civil disobedience. I honestly don't. It's going to be implemented. Some universities have already accepted it in the last 2 years. Some have not. It essentially tries to curtail legitimate speech on a foreign country. And this ties directly into what so many other government plans are, to curtail legitimate conversation. So I would say to Angus, keep speaking honestly about what is happening. Acknowledge and discuss and understand that what Israel is doing is a clear form of colonialism. There is nothing wrong with saying that. It is the reality, is the truth. There's colonialism that exists in other parts of the world. I'm not suggesting it's just in Palestine. Of course it's not. But that is what's happening.
Yeah, we'd do well to look into our own backyard.
Absolutely.
On that
There's
question.
ongoing colonialism here.
Yeah.
Undeniably so. And in many other parts of the world. And it's not accidental that virtually the entire Western world elite supports Israel. I mean, there's a reason for that. It's not surprising. So I would say to Angus, do not curtail what you think and what you say because of the fear of being smeared, of breaching this imaginary code. Even the founder of this code, people can find this online, says it's been weaponized in the service of trying to silence legitimate criticism of Israel. I don't accept it. I don't accept that code. I think many Australians will not accept it, and they shouldn't.
Talk to me about the path forward. Oh, it's a big question,
Yeah.
I know. But, in your mind, I mean, we've talked about some of the media coverage being inadequate. What in your mind will make it adequate?
Can we somehow make journalists grow a spine overnight? Is that something you guys can organise, or can you sort of inject courage into virtually every journalist writing about this into their spine? Can you organise that, please?
Can I? Yeah, I'll just open my container of courage. And,
I mean, that's
not
going to happen overnight, or probably maybe ever. The way forward to me is clearly understanding, and I think the Jewish Council of Australia has been really strong on this long before the Bondi attack, is that eventually our safety and security, our being Jewish safety, is tied up with everyone else's safety and security, Muslim, Christian, atheist, whatever, in a society. And if you as a state believe, and this is what I fear is going, that there is, inverted commas, special protection, I'm not just talking about security protection, but protection for Jews, that somehow we are told as a society, you can't say that about Israel. That leads to more antagonism and hatred towards Jews. I guarantee it. This is the opposite of what we should be doing. So to me, what we should be doing is talking to Jewish people, speaking to others, building communities of a belief that there has to be some shared endeavor here about what Australia should be. Australia needs to be a country which believes in equality for all, which might be an obvious thing to say. Everyone goes, no shit, mate. But is that how a lot of people in power view Australia? They don't. There's a hierarchy that exists. And Jewish lives are seen as far, far higher than Muslim lives, Arab lives, Palestinian lives. That has been so clear for decades, but especially since October 7, and especially since Bondi. Of course, Jews were the target of the attack. Yeah, Jews are feeling threatened, and we need to address that. But the way you address it is not to try to curtail free speech or association. I guarantee you that is the wrong way to address this, and it's going to lead to more hatred and more anti-Semitism. And I would argue the people pushing it are probably well aware of that, which makes it even worse. Does anyone in the pro-Israel lobby honestly believe that curtailing protests in the streets of Sydney is going to stop some ISIS-inspired lunatic getting a gun and killing someone? Does anyone honestly think that? Has any security expert said that? In fact, the security experts who have spoken in the last week, who are hardly radical left-wingers, are saying exactly that. This is like a...
What are they saying?
Well, they're basically saying that what the government is proposing, federal government, state government, and maybe legislating, is not likely to lead to an end to radicalization. It's not likely to lead to an end to hatred against Jews. It won't. And I would suggest, in fact, that that's not what the aim of this is. I see this as much bigger than just what Bondi is about. This is not really about Bondi. It really isn't. In the end, Bondi is a horrific terror attack, but the agenda of what is being pushed here existed, Jan, long before Bondi. Long before Bondi. The people who are arguing for these restrictions didn't suddenly say that the minute after Bondi. They've been saying it for years. In the UK, in the US, and here. So what I propose is, A, to reject that, and to embrace a community across all religions which says that you believe somehow in a better world. You believe that everyone deserves to have not just free speech, but free association safely. Now that, again, sounds like motherhood statements, but that's not where we're going here. Australia is going in the opposite direction. We are following the path of the US and the UK, of curtailing free speech and free association. And the people who suffer the most from that are minorities. Muslims, Jews, and others. I can see, and that's what's happening in the UK now. It's what's happening in the US now.
Okay, well, I'm not going to leave the podcast on that note, and it is Christmas Eve if people are listening to this on the day that it is streaming. So say something nice, say something good, say something. I've been heartened. I've been heartened by tell me what you've been heartened by.
I've been heartened by the fact there is and I really have to believe this, that there is a sizable part of the Australian community, Jew, Christian, Muslim, whatever, who not just grieves for what happened in Bondi, but actually do not believe that dividing society is the way that we're going to solve these problems. The community support, the huge amount of Sydney-siders donating blood after the Bondi attack. In the end, I think most people are good. I do actually believe that. But they are being manipulated by obviously awful forces. But no, I do believe that Australian society and community is able to rebuild from this if there's an acknowledgement that those who want to push division are not looking for our best interests. And the media's responsibility there is to question those people, not to give Pauline Hanson a microphone.
We haven't even talked about her.
We haven't, but it's just want to say that in the closing, that people like that, newsflash, are not looking for the betterment of Australia. But they're given an open mic. Please tell us your thoughts, Pauline, about how Australia can rebuild. Please give us your thoughts, Barnaby Joyce. And this is not just the Murdoch Press giving her a platform, by the way.
Yeah.
But the good news is...
Yeah, no, we definitely can't end on Pauline
Hanson.
Good news
is that there is, as I said, I do believe that there is a strong community spirit that exists in Sydney and Australia that rejects racism against anybody. Anybody. But will not tolerate racism directed against others. And there's a reason why huge amounts of Australians have been protesting against Israel for years, because they see that manifest. That is what the tragic, horrific, inevitable outcome of state-sanctioned racism is. That's what Gaza is. And they reject that. And those in power are petrified of that. That's actually, I'd say, more hopeful than it might sound. Most Australians don't support it. They don't. They don't support the genocide. They don't. Most Westerners are not supporting it. Growing numbers of Republicans don't support
yeah,
it.
Yeah.
There's a shift, but it's not reflected yet in the political elite, and it needs to be. Or media. That's a happy way to end it, isn't
That
it?
is a happy way. That's certainly a happier way to end it. Thank you so much for chatting to us on this episode. We really appreciate your thoughts. Merry Christmas to you.
I celebrate Christmas. I'm an atheist Jew. Of course, why wouldn't I?
Good. Merry all of it. I don't know
you
when
too.
people
and
are listening or
listeners
watching
and
this,
viewers,
but
yes.
happy holidays to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this conversation. And we will catch you next week in this feed for some special holiday episodes. Catch you then. Bye-bye.